My name is Rob Green. I'm the author of a book called From Wounds to Wisdom, Living a Conscious Life After a Traumatic Experience. And today I wanted to talk about an experience I had when I went to Tibet. And in Tibet is a highly Buddhist country, and a lot of people live in monasteries as children, and they get raised learning the Buddhist scriptures. And one thing I've found very interesting about Buddhism is its relationship to the mind. Now, as far as a spiritual practice in Buddhism, there is no concept of a God per se, not in the same way in Christianity or Hinduism or Islam. But the thing about Buddhism that I found appealing is that it really teaches one to observe and master their own mind and their own thoughts. Now, how can this come in handy in relationship to you healing a traumatic experience or you recovering from trauma? Because let's face it, all of us have had trauma. All of us have had negative experiences to one degree or another. We can't sit here and compare, because as soon as we start to get in comparison, we try to negate our trauma based on someone else's experience, which it's good for giving us a new perspective on things and appreciating what we have, but it's not an end-all fix-all for our own problems. I remember when I was a kid, I didn't really like the food that my parents were giving me, so sometimes I wouldn't eat it. And my dad would tell me, oh, well, there's kids starving in Africa who would kill for that food, so you better appreciate it. I had never been to Africa yet. I went to Africa later on in life when I was deployed there, but at that time, as an 8-year-old kid, I had no idea about the suffering and poverty of people in Africa, so I had no frame of reference to compare that to. So it was just an idea and a concept, and it didn't overshadow my immediate selfish, preference not to eat the food that my parents prepared. So whenever we don't have a real basis of comparison in terms of our experience, trying to compare our experience to another person's will give us a perspective, but it won't automatically fix everything. It opens the door for us to walk in that direction. Because if we want to start to fix things, if we want to start to heal ourselves, we have to be able to step out of the negative emotions of pain, out of the negative emotions of anger, out of the negative emotions of sadness, into the acceptance of an experience. And I think this is what a lot of people have a really hard time with. I know I struggled with this myself, especially being in the military and being conditioned to be afraid of my own emotions and vulnerability. We have to be willing to accept the experience. We have to be willing to accept defeat on an emotional level. Now, what does that really mean? Accepting defeat temporarily means that you admit to yourself that something was a painful experience. And a lot of the times we get caught up in these denial systems. Oh yeah, that happened, but I forget about him, or forget about this person. Oh, I'm okay now. We try to really condition and program ourselves that this experience isn't bothering us when it actually is. So what happens in that psychological process is that these negative emotions from whatever experience or experiences that we had will start to manifest in other ways and in other areas of our life. So when we can sit down with an emotion and finally admit defeat to it, admit to the fact that, okay, this hurt me. I was thinking back when I was a kid, when I lost my mom to cancer on Christmas Day of 1987, I spent a lot of time in denial. I saw my mother flatline. She died of cancer in 1987 on December 24th. And for a good portion of my life, I spent it in denial because my father remarried. I had a new mother now. And whenever that memory would come up, I would try to lean on present circumstances to cancel out a past emotion. And it didn't work because these kind of feelings of missing my mom, these kind of feelings of grief and sadness, they would always come up again later on. And I'd have to find a new way to try to trick myself into, not feeling something that I actually feel. So it came up to a point when I was in India in 2017 where I was actually able to revisit these memories and actually surrender to the fact that I felt these ways and not be afraid of that. Because I think a lot of the times, a lot of us are afraid of admitting our own pain to ourselves. We're afraid of admitting an experience actually hurt us, especially as men, because we're conditioned to be tough. At least in my generation. I don't know about the generation now, it's a bit different. But in my generation, when, if I was being punished by my father, if he was beating me and I would cry, I would get beat harder just for crying. And it conditioned me to basically be afraid of my own vulnerability. So breaking through that barrier and actually being able to sit with myself and say, okay, this happened. This is the emotion I felt around it. This is how I honestly feel. This is the honest effect it had on me. And not run away from it, because as soon as we feel something uncomfortable come up in mind, our natural response is to run away and try to self-medicate, try to justify, try to do anything we can to pacify that emotion, to make it go away because we don't want to feel it. But the truth is, you have to feel it to heal it. So the longer you spend running away from yourself, the more time that you try to justify, to overcompensate, to basically point your attention in other areas, the longer that emotion is just going to sit there and come revisit you. You know, I talk a lot about this in my book, but overcompensating in an area of life, it's probably one of the healthiest coping mechanisms, but it's not an end-all, fix-all. So if you grew up, for example, poor, and you want to devote all of that trauma and the trauma from the negative experience and all that energy to being successful, it can work to get you to a certain place, but those emotions still need to be addressed. Because if that was really true, if materials, wealth and circumstances and having status in society was the end-all, fix-all for everything, then why have we lost so many wealthy people to mental health issues? Why did we lose Kate Spade, who was a billionaire fashion designer, to suicide? Why did Robin Williams commit suicide? Why have so many others been lost to their own mental health issues despite having a favorable circumstance in their material life? So yes, obviously you need to survive in the world, and being comfortable and having status and all that is very important, but I really want to iterate that it's not an end-all, fix-all. Even though you can use that energy and can use that trauma to fuel you towards growth, there's going to come a point where you're eventually going to have to cope with it, face it, and deal with it so you can process it and let it go. So to sum this whole thing up, the longer you spend running away from yourself, the longer you try to lie to yourself, the longer you don't look in that place within you, the more those things are just going to come back to haunt you in other ways, because there is no escape from yourself. I'll say that again. There is no escape from yourself. No matter where you go in the world, you're always going to bring you with you. And no matter who you're with, you're always with yourself, because yourself is an integral part of you. And if you're carrying negative emotions, experiences, trauma, and emotional baggage that hasn't been processed, it's always going to find its way into your life some form or another. It's always going to poke its head into your business in some way or another. So you might as well just deal with it, admit defeat to that emotion, meaning don't let it control your life, but meaning that you admit to yourself that it did hurt you or it did make you feel a certain way. Process the emotion in a healthy way and allow yourself to be free from the experience and let go. Because the longer you hang on, the longer you spend in denial, the longer you spend looking away, is the more that thing is just going to try to find its way into your life another way. It's like a termite infestation in the house. If you break up the line in one place, they're just going to find another way in. So it's the same way with negative emotions and experiences that we're trying to run from and get away from.